Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to At Bristol and this Bristol Festival of Ideas event in association with Bristol 2015. I'll do a proper introduction in a moment. My name's Andrew Kelly, but first of all, to welcome us to the event, I'd like to introduce Andrew Garrard, who is chairman of Bristol 2015. Andrew.
It's a great pleasure to welcome you, but also the panel here to Bristol in this year, which is a pretty important year for us. We have 5 themes: energy, and I say that first because that's my background, food, resources, transport, and nature. And clearly, this evening and today and tomorrow is about nature, and clearly, we really want in 2015 to encourage all the forces of nature to work together to improve the nature and the habitat of Bristol, to improve Bristol, to make it a happier, healthier place. One of the great joys for me in doing this job has been the privilege of meeting all sorts of important, influential, interesting people in all different walks of life. And from my brief introduction in the green room, if that's what it's called back there, clearly we have got the movers and shakers of this, and then I shouldn't call it the nature industry, I suppose that's the wrong phrase to use, but if it was my normal habitat, it would be the leaders of our industry, and they are here, and I think it's a fantastic achievement for Bristol, and also perhaps particularly for Bevis Watts, to have got such a panel here to talk about such important stuff, which is absolutely congruent with the objectives of our year. So welcome to Bristol, all of you, and particularly the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. As I said, this is part of a programme of work, not just 2015, but a theme that we've had this spring looking at nature, partly through the remarkable story of the Romantic poets in Bristol. I don't know how many people have been to some of our other events as part of this series, but Romanticism started in the city. They were very preoccupied with issues of nature and the environment and emotions, and we've used that to look at aspects of Bristol 2015 through their eyes. For example, on Friday we have 21 contemporary poets in this room reading new poetry that we've commissioned as part of this work. But tonight we're looking at, as we have been today and tomorrow, at the issues around nature and well-being. And part of today, for example, has been a conference looking at a project that the RSPB and others have done. Tomorrow is a summit looking at nature and well-being, but within the context of one of the things we'll be talking about tonight, which is the Potential Nature and Wellbeing Act. I've got a wonderful panel here tonight. First of all, though, I'd like to thank all those people who have helped put this event on and the week's events. Particularly the Avon Wildlife Trust came to us first, and I'd like to thank them, and particularly Bevis Watts. The key partners in this event are the Wildlife Trusts overall, the RSPB, and the National Trust, and we've been generously supported tonight by the EU Life and Communications Programme and the Bristol 2015 and the Bristol 2015 Bristol Festival of Ideas. On the panel, on my far left, Miranda Krestovnikoff, who's a wildlife expert, well known from being on the BBC programmes, and the president of the RSPB. To my immediate left is Professor Sir John Lawton, eminent British ecologist, vice president of the RSPB and president of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, amongst many other things. To my immediate right is Stephanie Hilborne, chief executive of the Wildlife Trusts, and on her right is Simon King, again well known to us as wildlife filmmaker, president of the Wildlife Trust and president of the Avon Wildlife Trust. I've asked each of them to talk very briefly about an aspect of nature and well-being, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. This is very much your evening, your chance to debate and question and comment, and we very much hope that that will take place tonight. So I'm going to start with Simon King. Simon.
I simply want to start by reflecting on my very personal journey, which originates here in Bristol. I was born in East Africa, but we moved to the UK when I was 2, and we moved to Bristol. And so I went to school here. I went to school in Sea Mills, both infant and junior school, and then went to Hembury Comprehensive School. And my backyard, if you like, was Blaze Woods, which many of you will be very familiar with. And it was both literally in my back garden, the postage stamp of a semi-detached house in Sea Mills on reflection, which, of course, when you're a child, is a jungle. And access, when I was allowed out into the woods themselves, that kindled my passion for the natural world. And I have to say, along that journey, there were some sacrificial critters. Not because I went out with an air gun, because I didn't, but because as a child, I, like every child, got my hands dirty. And of course I caught smooth newts in the pond, and yes, I brought them home. And did I put them in aquaria? Yes, I absolutely did. And did they sometimes get out and end up behind the bookshelf as a petrified beastie? I'm sorry to say that one or two of them did. But without that genuine first-hand connection, I'm not sure that what has lasted to this day as a very visceral connection to the natural world would have had the same degree of passion. And what I sincerely hope will come out of both this evening's discussion and indeed the fact that this year Bristol represents the green capital of Europe in 2015, but more importantly in perpetuity, is just how vital it is that we maintain this connection between ourselves and the rest of the world. And whilst it's important that we do, of course, have a name for this, and nature is the one that's banded around, we mustn't begin to think that we aren't a part of it, because we absolutely are. We are part of nature. It is part of us. And if we neglect that very basic and simple fact, we will be responsible for our own undoing, which sounds like a sermon, and I wasn't planning to go there. But it is really with that spirit that I'd like us to engage this evening.
Miranda, you're particularly going to look at people and children in this.
Although I work in television and conservation and conversation, I'm also here as a mother, as a parent, as a family member. Oh, there we go. That's fantastic. So I wanted to speak as a parent, really, about the aspects of health and also connectivity with nature that Simon so eloquently just described. Health-wise, if you imagine the last time you were outside, I can't imagine that you would describe that as maybe a stressful situation. It probably would be a happy situation. You were there, it was relaxing, it was maybe cleansing, you were out there to clear your head. For me, the aspects of health and the benefits of the benefits of nature are so much more than just exercise. It's being outside, experiencing our natural surroundings. I think the problem is it's not very quantifiable, the benefits of nature. There's a lot in the media about exercise being a miracle cure for diabetes and mental health problems and stress and cancer. And being outside in our natural environment means that we are exercising, we are moving around, and hopefully this can be very beneficial for our health. As a parent, I notice with my children, they spend a lot of time outside exercising and breathing fresh air. And I notice that they are very, very rarely ill. Now, you can put that down to good genes or healthy eating, but I put that down a lot to just the fact that they're experiencing nature and well-being. The big thing about the environment and nature is its accessibility. It's free to all. It's everywhere. It's not just your local park. It's just walking outside. You just need a pair of wellies. But in our very sort of artificial and commercial society, we often think you have to exercise. You have to go to a gym in order to exercise. At the end of the day, I think we just need to go outdoors. Simon talked about the importance of connectivity. I'm very passionate about trying to connect people with nature, especially children. And I see it in my own family, and I think it's really important that we make nature relevant to society, especially our children. How people can be a part of society, how they can find a value for nature, but also a value for themselves within the environment. So it's really important that we have high-quality natural places near to where everybody lives and works, so we can all get out and enjoy nature and realise the value of nature. So for me, the most important parts are health and connectivity.
Thank you, Miranda. One of the things we're talking about tonight is the Nature and Wellbeing Act. So John, why is this needed?
I'm an environmental scientist, and I actually live in York, in the north of England. And unlike Simon, I have to confess, this is the first time I've ever been to Bristol. Connect with your audience. That's what you've got to do. That's what you've got to do. However, I'm also probably the oldest person on the panel, and I have 5 grandchildren, the eldest of whom are twin boys who are 21. So the thing that motivates me, now my own children are clearly mums and dads themselves, well into being mums and dads, I worry like hell about my grandchildren. The youngest is 12. The eldest are twins, and they're 21. And the point of a Nature and Wellbeing Act is just so blindingly obvious to me that I can't see why many of our politicians just don't get it. This afternoon, the whole of today actually, I've been involved in the meeting that was in here on conservation, large landscape level conservation, and taking part in that. And one of the things we were talking about was a thing that I was instrumental, along with Steph, in getting off the ground, which is a thing called nature improvement areas. There are 12 in England at the moment, where local communities, from the bottom up, have been creating space for nature on their own doorstep. And they were actually part of a national competition to establish 12 nature improvement areas. And one of the actually unsuccessful bids, but was still a very important bid from one of the great northwest cities in England, where the leader of the city council, in their bid for that nature improvement area, said that access to high quality green space and interesting nature is not an impediment to economic growth. It is fundamental to economic growth. I wish I could have given him an NIA, but the bid was lacking in other ways. But boy, had he got it. It's a thing that many of our politicians, for reasons that baffle me, simply don't get. Some of them do. And part of tonight's discussion, I hope, will allow us to explain the arguments why access to nature and high-quality green space is not just good for nature, it's good for people, children, and grandchildren.
Thank you very much, Sir John. And Stephanie, you'll talk a little bit about the Nature and Wellbeing Act.
That was your plan?
Yeah.
No, I will. I mean, I just say that I just wanted to make it clear that I have lived 3 years of my life in Bristol, and I love your city. You know, I don't in any way want this popularity contest or anything. And I've been coming back a bit more often because my best mate's moved here, so I've come to see her a bit more. But the city's transformed in that time. I actually grew up in Surrey, and I was a feral child in the woods of Surrey, and along with other people on the panel, the thing that breaks your heart most is when you're working with trusts who are taking kids out to the beach in Cornwall who live half a mile away but they've never been to the beach before. Or, you know, kids who are living in Dagenham don't even know there's a river in London because, you know, there's a generation that are growing out so separate from nature that it, for our generation, probably is just shocking in the sense of what they're losing from that. So the concept of this Nature and Wellbeing Act is a bit like a comparison to what happened after the Second World War with the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. It's just that back then, you didn't even have to make the case for why it was a sensible plan that we looked after on the natural world and that people were enjoying it. And now we have to rally the evidence and make the case for what is sort of intuitively pretty obvious. I mean, you see a lion pacing its cage and you know why, don't you? It wasn't designed to be in a cage, as I extremely tactlessly and to my cost said to the chief exec of Barrett's Homes recently. We weren't designed to live in a box, you know. And it wasn't my best diplomatic moment, but, you know, it's true. We were sort of evolutionary designed not to be. And Tony Juniper, in his first book, he's just published another book, said on the train journey from London to Cambridge, man joined the planet about the time he's putting his ticket through the barrier at Cambridge. That's how recent we are as an addition. And then whilst we've been here, it's only a very short number of years of our time on the planet that we've not been absolutely part of the natural world. We've pulled ourselves away from it. So the concept of the Nature and Wellbeing Act, in a way, was just to get away from everyone arguing about the intricacies and details of specific bits of controlling other people type policy and say, actually, the nation needs to restore the natural environment we're living in and also take major steps to reconnect our children and ourselves with the natural world. And one part of that is that we have learned how to protect particularly important sites for nature in cities and in rural areas, but we haven't learned how to restore nature to our cities and to our rural areas. And the initiative that Bevis has led with the Avon Wildlife Trust to map Bristol through the eyes more of a bee rather than through the eyes of a human is very interesting, because we can inadvertently block passages for whether it's birds or insects or the habitat of all the wildlife of the city. And quite easily we could be creating that habitat, whether it's green roofs or whether it's parklands. So there's what we're asking for in the Act is that local authorities are required to be mapping future nature. And we're also looking at what provisions could be put through the education legislation, or that's obviously mostly in the curriculum, to make sure kids are outdoors more during the school day. And there's a whole load of other areas around. I know this could be a controversial subject today, but this issue of monitoring the natural capital of the nation, because currently we are eroding the natural resource of the nation without counting what we're losing. So it's looking at a national level, at how we can be actually monitoring what's happening to our natural resource. So that's the concept of the Act, and a lot of wildlife organisations and in fact organisations like Mind are very interested in promoting this. We are promoting it, but as John made reference to, a lot of politicians at the moment aren't sort of completely getting. In the Labour Party's, for instance, not getting this is a major inequality at the moment, access to nature, for instance. So we have a big task in hand we need your help with to get this onto the statute.
Thank you. We'll come back to that later on. I wanted to just ask a couple of the panel members to reflect a little bit on two things. The first is about Bristol is European Green Capital. It's a city. It's about nature and the city here. What have you got, Simon? You talked about growing up here in nature here. How important is nature to a city in terms of its feel and growth and education and whatever?
I've had the good fortune of travelling all over the planet, and I've seen some very, very urban places. And I've witnessed, just as Steph referred to earlier, the same sort of separation of humanity from the rest of life on a grand scale and on a microcosm. And without a shadow of a doubt, those human beings who are best off and happiest and most content and fit are those who have a genuine connection to what I refer to as the real world. In Bristol specifically, I feel very privileged to have gone to school and grown up here, because it is a green city. It's one of the reasons it's had this great accolade of being voted Green Capital of Europe 2015. Is there more that can be done? Absolutely. But the very fact that I, as a child, was able to lie with my chin against a French window, it makes it sound terribly grand. It really wasn't. It was just a door with glass at the bottom. And watch foxes within half a metre of my face, and to see hedgehogs stumbling around in the same space, to see a sparrowhawk grab a house sparrow and to try and make a garden pond, and witness that magical moment when the first water boatman comes out of the sky and lands into that puddle of water which you have proffered, was testament to the fact that this place has a fabric and an infrastructure which goes beyond our own cement short-term thinking. And it isn't simply the intrinsic value of the natural world, it's the extrinsic values too, as we've been referring to. You know, this idea of natural capital being contentious, and yes, of course, well, it doesn't really matter what you call it. Is it good for our economy? Yes, for lots of reasons which we can go into in greater depth. Is it good for people? Yes. Is it good for our future? Yes. And without it, will we unravel? Yes. We're really just doing what we should, which is safeguarding our own future. The difference is that we're not thinking about a 4-year term. We're not thinking about short-termism, which is so prevalent in most politics, sadly, today, because everybody seems to be concerned about whether they're going to get voted in or not. Really, one should be thinking about, are we going to survive or not? Are we going to survive in a sustainable fashion? And so is the green infrastructure of a city a vital part of city life and humanity? Undoubtedly so.
And I'd like to ask Miranda that question as well about nature-rich cities and what makes a nature-rich city, really.
I think we're very lucky here in Bristol. I'm sure you are all residents of Bristol, but we have a lot of big green spaces here, a lot of very well-managed wildlife reserves, which are very nature-rich. And I think the exciting thing about Bristol being green capital is that Bristol is full of very dynamic people, and it's full of very strong organisations. It's a city where things happen. And I know that there are people who are a bit cynical about the whole 2015 thing, but I feel very excited about it. I think this is a city where a lot is going to happen this year, and then we're going to create new nature reserves. We're going to be planting an awful lot of trees. There are going to be some immensely exciting community projects happening this year. So I'm very fired up about it. And
a point to ask all of you, really, which as Simon referred to it and Sir John did, is about the issue about politics and politicians. And we're heading towards a general election now where it's one of the few times when politicians seem to listen to us and knock on our doors in some cases, particularly in a marginal seat. What are we saying to them? You know, how strong is this demand? You know, how much do we need to fight for this? How hard is it going to be? Sir John?
I think it's very hard, actually. There are amongst the many politicians I get to meet, I would say about a third of them really do get the importance of the natural environment, but there's an awful lot who don't. And the worry I have is there's a huge amount of misinformation out there. You will find politicians of all political shades absolutely convinced that things like the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive from the European Union, which are major plans. Whatever you think about the European Union, be careful what you would wish for. Because a huge amount of the environmental protection we have is based on European directives, who are absolutely convinced that those directives are a massive impediment to development and economic growth. If I were to ask you, what percentage of major infrastructure projects over the last decade have been refused and failed because of the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, the wicked block to economic growth, what's the percentage that have actually failed? Anybody want to guess? 0.5%. Half of 1%. It is nonsense that those directives are an impediment to economic growth. They are absolutely essential to healthy economic growth, and they're not an impediment to jobs at all. But you talk to politicians, and there's an awful lot of them who won't get rid of them because they're an impediment to economic growth. It is utter nonsense.
Stephanie, do you want to come back on this one?
Well, obviously, I agree with John. It's a brave person who doesn't. No, I mean, I think the interesting thing is we talk to the industry, most industries,
yeah,
especially the big, well-organised ones, they don't see this as a barrier at all.
No, exactly.
And this is just a kind of almost trying to be seen to be on the side of business behaviour by a number of politicians. And in fact, it's when a lot of the challenge was coming at the beginning of this government about the red tape of nature, it was often us lining up with businesses that was challenging the government. They were just completely shocked. So this is all part of our bigger picture of feeling as if the politicians, a number of them, and a number of them are wonderful people, but a number of politicians are too disconnected from the reality of what's happening in the real world on the ground, where a lot of businesses and non-governmental organisations across the social and environment sector have incredibly productive relationships which lead to the right solutions all the time, and that really this is not an issue. The environmental regulation is not holding back growth at all, really, and as John said, it's in fact stimulating it. And it's profound. I mean, there's an organisation called British Influence that's been set up to promote our remaining connected, being part of the European Union. And it's a very interesting grouping because it's gathering the middle ground politicians from across the political spectrum, including, the Tories who are very pro-Europe. And listening to them talking is a breath of fresh air, really, because they can see the benefits of this. And they can see the changes in the water quality across Europe that resulted from European directives, and as well as the changes in air quality, although we haven't been very good at implementing the air side of it, as well as nature. There's sort of a bit of it's really clear that this is a kind of a side issue that people are using as an easy one to hit at.
And one final question maybe before we open it up is why do we need an excuse for nature? You know, I work in the arts, and you know we're always asked to justify our existence in terms of economic development or jobs created or growth. I mean, why do we need? I mean, why not nature for nature's sake, as against arts for art's sake? Sir John?
Well, I mean, that's a complete no-brainer. We're human beings. Nature. Actually, I must be. I think I am unusual in another way. I'm unusual in lots of ways, but unusual in one way, in that I have been active throughout my entire life as in the nature conservation movement. But also, I am currently chairman of the York Museums Trust. So I'm in charge of the York Art Gallery, the Castle Museum, and so on and so forth in all of the York museums. There is no difference in my mind at all between the cultural advantages of the arts and museum sector, which I'm hugely proud of in York, and my wildlife conservation. They enrich people's lives. What are we alive for if all we're interested in, once you have a job, and of course people need jobs, they need things, but once you've got that, we need things that enrich our lives. And nature and the arts and museums enrich our lives, and they're part of being human. And I don't care what the economic arguments are. I want that to be there for its own sake across that spectrum.
You'd share that view, Simon?
Absolutely, of course. But
we don't have to defer to
no.
Sir John.
I'm trying to be controversial, Simon.
The trouble is, well, I can't.
think if
It's
it
impossible
doesn't
to
like
disagree
nature,
with
it's
the
gonna be hard.
principle. I have to say, I take it a step further, that our society affords enormous value to artifacts created by humanity.
Yeah.
You know, one only has to look at the astonishing prices garnered by great works, and I don't deny for a moment that they are great works, whether it's a Picasso or whether it's a Rembrandt, that they are enshrined in these beautiful buildings created by people worth hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds. And we see that price tag and we say, gosh, that's our natural heritage. And then we see a frog and we say, well, that's not worth much, is it? I would argue that it is worth every bit as much, if not more, than any Rembrandt or any Picasso or any great institution. And I wouldn't suggest for a moment that we should shift the bias of those values. I think they have their place. But to think of these things as anything less than astonishing works of art, if you like, created, in my opinion, through an evolutionary journey over millennia, is to bury your head in the most astonishing level of ignorance. So, to me, of course, I feel, and I imagine most of the people in the room here this evening feel the intrinsic value of nature, but there are also, as I referred to earlier, these basic economic advantages to having a great green infrastructure in place, whether it is the quality of the water that we drink, right now we pay for water about 4 times over through ludicrous systems, as was pointed out in Tony Juniper's recent book, What Has Nature Done, or What Does Nature Do for Britain? If you haven't read it, do. Through subsidies to farmers to put stuff on fields which we actually probably don't need, that then gets into the soil, that finds its way into the water, that we then pay our water companies to get out again because it will poison us, and then we come and pump it and drink it. That's nuts. Nature does it. You get the big bog at the top of the hill right, the stuff that comes down into the river is pure and you can drink it with your hands. If you've been lucky enough to be in a wild space where you can do that, okay, albeit perhaps a dead sheep halfway up the stream, but you can get by. We've all done that at some point. I have. You will realise the value of it. We've had this great hoo-ha, particularly close to home in Somerset. You know, I used to live on the Somerset levels, and last winter, devastating effects on a number of people. I will point out a relatively small number of people on the levels, but a big patch of ground that got very wet. Now, had we not been stomping around the Mendip Hills with big, heavy tractors and compressing the soil, destroying the very infrastructure that holds water like a sponge, it might not have been so extreme. Or it might have been a 100-year episode or a 50-year episode, and I'm sure we're going to see more of it because undoubtedly we are affecting our climate in a dramatic way. And the future will swing in the balance of nature's resources and services that protect us against the most extreme effects of climate change. And if again we think we're going to do it with a new plan, with a new drain, with a new canalized piece of river for somebody else's contract to dig that river once a year, then we're just kidding ourselves. Because ultimately and fundamentally, we know the science is there and well established and in place that the natural systems will do it better than anything that we can do. But we've got to give nature space, time, and facility to do what it does best.
Miranda and Stephanie, just Froggies is as important as a Picasso. What do you think about that?
Definitely to my children, a frog is as important as Picasso. Yeah. They wouldn't see the relevance of art, but they get very, very excited every time they have a connection with wildlife. And it's that connection which is really, really important, bringing children in, getting them to care, because they're the next generation.
Stephanie?
Yeah, well, I remember when the Severn Estuary was last being discussed in terms of potential barrage and a potentially very destructive barrage, somebody had come up with the idea that although the Severn Estuary has the second highest tidal reach in the world, I think, it's an extraordinary natural phenomenon, it'd be fine to destroy that, really, and as long as we had a large wetland somewhere on mainland Europe. So I said, well, for me, that's like ripping out Westminster Abbey and putting Guildford Cathedral there instead. They went, oh, you wouldn't want to do that. And it's all about what we understand and what we know and the contact we have with nature. So we have to, it's a long-term campaign to get us back in touch, so it's intuitive in us that we understand the impact of some of these things.
You've mentioned between you quantifying benefits of nature. You've mentioned green capital, not the European green capital, but that is being able to quantify what nature does for us. And I can see what could on the surface look like a polarity between those who want to do that or see the need for that and those who wish to have the natural world remain ineffable, mysterious, and everything like that. Do you see those two being squared? Do you think that we can quantify and show to the powers that be the ways that nature can help us and therefore slot it into that growth and development mindset that seems to prevail in a modern industrial economy, whilst retaining that ineffableness of it, I suppose? Poor word, but yeah.
I don't think that they're mutually exclusive premises. Thank you for the question. I think there are two things. One is if we're human beings and we work with language. We happen to speak English this evening. And it is a question of how you communicate the value of something to somebody who so far doesn't get it. If you are able to enter into a discourse saying something has natural capital, a crested newt is worth £500,000. Why? I don't know, but let's just say that. And we've got 52 crested newts in this pond. And that starts a conversation which works in a language that somebody who doesn't know a crested newt from their cranial crest, then you are on a road. And that road, one would hope, will take that person eventually to meet a crested newt and to understand the intrinsic value of what that means, of what it means to be a part of the real world. But further than, even more importantly, I think, not this slightly vague, nebulous idea of the value of something that most of us, I'm sure, will believe has an intrinsic value, but the very real cost-saving exercises in any economy, in any developed economy, which was where we are now, in ensuring that we live in a sympathetic and sustainable way with nature, because it can be shown absolutely and empirically. One only there are brains far greater than mine that can give you chapter and verse on the pounds and pence benefits of a 15, 20, 30-year program to stop using phosphates and nitrates on land in terms of the value, the cost-saving exercise of that. And it's not simply, we are losing crops, therefore we have done badly. It is how long does it take to make up the loss in terms of what you save through having to extract those chemicals from natural systems that otherwise we ingest and poison ourselves with. So that's just one good example. Air is another. Food, of course. is a fundamental one. And actually, something I didn't mention earlier, when I did live in Sea Mills, my back garden, little postage stamp, backed onto a triangle which was all allotments. And those allotments were not just good for people, because of course they were, and my neighbours were out and digging and planting their leeks and eating their potatoes, as indeed we were. But they were great for hedgehogs and for foxes and for everything else. And so the idea that there's a mutual exclusivity between the pound-pence value of nature and its intrinsic value, I think is something we need to let go of, because they can work, in my opinion, entirely harmoniously.
Miranda, just on, you broadcaster as well. I mean, how do you talk about these things? Do you talk about the economic value of nature when or is it more about the kind of other factors that have been discussed?
I think for me, I don't get involved in the economics of it at all. For me, it's just it's sharing a passion and showing a relevance of nature to everybody, whether you're into conservation or not. And I think that's where the value comes from.
I mean, how much is a skylark worth? I have absolutely no idea. But I know it's not zero, and I know it's not infinity, which is not actually very helpful. But it's not worth. It isn't. Its value is not zero. So there are some questions in this area which are just daft to ask, and you wouldn't conserve skylarks because you could put £1, shillings and pence value on a skylark. But there are other things that nature provides for us, as Miranda and Simon have pointed out, that we can put a value on. And I'll just give you one. And we talked about. People talk about ecosystem services, which I think is a dreadful word. Let's think about the work that nature does for us. And let's think about a water company. Let's think about South West Water down in the Coombe Grasslands in Devon, or United Utilities on the Pennines, who are spending millions and millions of your money to replace and restore grasslands in the catchments. Why on earth would a water company do that? Because it turns out to be 6 times more expensive to build a water treatment works than it does to restore the grassland. So you can put a value on it. And under those circumstances, South West Water and the Coombe Grasslands in Devon and United Utilities in the northwest, in the north of England, are spending huge amounts of their customers' money restoring grasslands for the good of nature, for the landscape, and because it saves them money. So under those circumstances, you would want to put a value on nature, but it isn't the only reason for conserving nature, because I just want to hear skylarks.
I guess one of the major concerns for me, as I'm somebody who runs a business that actually engages businesses and takes them out, because it seems to me that it's, and this is a very broad sweep of the brush, that it's the business community that we need to engage, to convince, if you like. I wonder whether or not part of the question that the questions that we should be looking at are actually about moving, what I'm developing in my own work is taking people out with a view to, whilst they're out, part of the process is to move away from the quantitative mind and move into the qualitative mind. And by doing that, that opens everything up, and then they can go back and actually move back into the quantitative mind with actually a much clearer sense of where they need to go, because they've dropped into the intuitive and out of the mechanical, if that's a very broad sweep of the brush. But I suppose my question to the panel is, how do we do that? How do we start to engage businesses in a way that actually stops this kind of numerical obsession and actually moves into the qualities of nature, and actually how that can be incredibly beneficial? Thank you.
It's quite major as a question. But I think you've got to the heart of it, really, because there's a lot of stuff that you don't have to use numbers to convince any business person of, and a lot of it's around their people. So whether that's the customers they're dealing with, their staff, the local community, they understand, or most businesses understand already, that that's the centre of their world. and the productivity of their staff is critical, and the way their customers are thinking about them is critical, and all of that's intuitive, all of that's qualitative. So in a way, I think a lot of the numbers stuff is something you use after you've won the heart for them to win the minds of someone else almost, or to feel that they can be justified in feeling that. Because almost everyone already feels it, but they've been taught that that's not enough. You have to have some numbers as well. And that's, I don't know whether that's a particularly British take on it, but I mean, I think this whole sort of, if it feels right, there must be something wrong. You know, you've got to be tough and do something that feels bad sometimes. Whereas actually we need to join up the people side with the nature side. So as soon as you're talking to businesses about taking people out where they're going to learn teamwork and they're going to actually bond with each other and you're going to get more productive workforce, then the fact that's also in nature and they feel less stressed and they start to learn and love wildlife more is all just an added bonus, isn't it? There's a new report I think the Green Building Council have produced. I'm a trustee of the Green Building Council about productivity in offices and about the quality of the environment you're operating within, which shows amazing productivity gains from people being outside more and from green views and all this sort of stuff. It's just sort of obvious in a way, but there's a bit more quantification of it.
So,
to make the argument with someone else usually.
I think we should introduce a green press gang that goes out and bludgeons people, drags them by their ankles into the middle of the field, straps them to a tree.
That's a very extreme view. You
Leaves
haven't
them for half
expressed
an
that,
hour.
is it?
Now, I'm using that really as a sort of a ridiculous metaphor for taking people, as you so wonderfully do, out and getting them to put their fingers in the grass. Because so many of us, there is a generation, maybe two, of people who haven't done that. And that simple disconnect is one of the greatest hurdles that we face. And I think that one way of perhaps bridging the gap, because maybe, I'd like to think not, but maybe it's too late for some, is through children. Because everybody who has, I would hope, a child cares about that child's welfare and well-being. And if that child comes back from school, where we do still have some capacity to impose upon the human being a curriculum and a presence and an exposure to things that we think matter, and that child, as part of the curriculum, is forced to put their fingers in the grass and comes back and says, let's go and do that this weekend, Dad, Mum, then maybe it will find its way into the hearts and souls of people who have sadly lost their way or never had the way shown to them. And we are the most extraordinary creatures, and that I've yet to meet a person, a human being, who doesn't feel good about themselves when they have time to reflect upon their place in space. Most of us don't take that time or aren't given the opportunity to take that time. By given the opportunity, we can all do it, of course, but most of us, as Steph said earlier, don't feel we can. We have this sort of self-flagellating, I've got to do this, and then I've got to do the washing, then I've got to do this, and then I've got to get back and fix the car, and hang on, how about we just stop and we go for a walk and we listen? And you haven't got to know the difference between a song thrush and a blackbird song to understand that that sweet melody is beautiful. You haven't got to know the difference between a grasshopper and a cricket to look in wonder at this minutiae of life that crawls around your ankles. And it's just taking the time to do it. And how do we, I think this so often, and at risk of being politically deeply incorrect, there are great tranches of society that think of it as the most ludicrous way of spending time and exercise. And sadly, they're very often people who are, everybody's a voter, who will think about nothing other than their own personal fiscal gain on a daily basis. But again, I don't believe that anyone, or very few of those individuals, would feel that way if they were almost physically taken into green space. And what I'm talking about here is quality green space, not some hermetically sealed phosphate-fed lawn, something which has got some nettles and some stuff in it, some life in it, quality green space, and get them to spend time. I know one of the things the trusts do so beautifully with so many groups of young people is quite literally take them out of an environment which is almost invariably, or so often, incredibly human and urban, and do just that. Break them up, break the group up, and sit them under trees and in fields. And for the tiny ones, you give them 3 minutes or 2 minutes, and for the older ones, you give them 15 or 20 minutes, and It's a rare child that doesn't come back from that with some kind of epiphany, because they'll have had the time to hear themselves, and we don't do it. I think it's tragic.
Stephanie, you wanted to come back on this?
Well, I thought maybe I agree with you, Simon, but I think it is really hard now. And one of the reasons it's hard, and I'm an owner of a teenage boy.
Oh, no.
Yeah. One of the reasons it's hard is, that actually it's not boring inside anymore. There was a limit when I was a kid to how you could entertain yourself inside. And I spent a lot of time with Lucy in the middle trying to do this. You'd play a certain number of board games, then you were bored. You'd maybe read as though you're bored. And then you'd have to go outside to find anything interesting to do. And that's not true anymore, which is a profound change, I think, for that sort of teenage group, particularly the boys. And, even as somebody who works for the Wildlife Trust, getting my son outside and what I consider as enough is a massive challenge. And if I find it a challenge, in the job I do, I just think we've got a huge challenge. Another issue is the access to really amazing places on your doorstep. I was incredibly lucky. I just happened to grow up in somewhere owned mostly by the local authority that you could have free access to. You could walk in there at 100 yards. And most people don't have that. And how do we create that? And so the work that trusts like the Avon Wildlife Trust do in cities is absolutely critical to help local authority work with local authorities, other groups, to create spaces that are really special, that you can just walk into on your way to school, on your way to work. And see, as I think most of you may have seen, something extraordinary. I don't think many people see a weasel on the back of a green woodpecker, but the fact that somebody saw that in Hornchurch, wherever it was in Hornchurch, is totally amazing. That wasn't in the depths of the countryside. So it's a two-pronged attack we need to have, which is to provide the space for people, and then it's to empower people to feel that they can be out in it.
If you see the Times today, and Peter Brooks has a cartoon of that,
oh, really?
Which has Nigel Farage on the back of David Cameron flying through the air. So you need to take a look at that. Just
can I
slightly
just
ruin the
I
image
want to
now
ask
for
Miranda
me.
a question as well. Just a quick one about children and accessibility and so on. But come back on this.
But I just wanted to echo what Simon said as well. That there is quite a lot of emphasis on schools and children trying to learn outside the classroom,
really
and there's a big push now to do more like this. But we don't seem to apply that to businesses. The emphasis is all on children, but actually I think we can use that model and actually apply that to businesses and hopefully see an increase in productivity there.
Quick one, Simon.
May I add one more draconian measure, potentially? Yeah. Well, it's not really. Again, it comes down to parenting, in the sense that you are absolutely right, Steph, that, of course, the facility to occupy one's mind is absolute in a box. And as a consequence, that's why I firmly believe, and I'm partly responsible for it through television in the past, it's one of the ills of our current society that we have the capacity to quash constructive boredom. And if there is one thing that connects people to the real world, it's constructive boredom. And so I would implore any parent to have very, very, very strict rules, draconian rules if you like, about how much time any young person, or any person for that matter, spends in a virtual world. Not because I think the virtual world is as of and in itself a bad thing, but because it prevents the mind from finding itself and wandering into the real world. And that's what we need to do. We need to literally kick them out the back door and say, go and do something. I don't want. It used to be the norm. I'll see you at tea time. That was normal.
Okay.
And so I think it's a vital part of
I'm going to take the next question, but I think on the question of business, one thing we should do is throw the challenge to Andrew Garrard, actually, in Bristol 2015, and get you to take up the issue of the Nature and Wellbeing Act with all your business contacts and all the Go Green people and get them behind it. Yeah? That's a task.
If you could sort that.
Yeah. Let's go. Get on with that. That's good.
I may be about to shoot myself in the foot here because I've taken the plunge and I'm going into politics to run for Parliament to campaign for exactly this kind of thing. I'm a huge supporter of the idea of a Nature and Wellbeing Act. But there is that sense that even if the party that I happen to be running for might get a few more seats this time round, that if we go down the political route, it might be years and years before something as inspiring as Nature and Wellbeing Act gets into legislation. So Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, raises this issue of the idea of blockadia, of groups of people finally getting so frustrated and so angry about us ruining our natural environment and through this growth mentality, that it's time that people rise up and almost take direct action to get this momentum that we need in order to fight back against this growth mentality. And I wondered what the panel might see as that blockadia moment. What might be that thing in the UK where perhaps we don't have the massive oil pipeline that people are going to fight over? What might be the UK's issues that might prompt a blockadia response?
I'll ask the panel that, but I should say that any member of the panel's comments cannot be seen as an endorsement of any particular candidate in this general election.
Absolutely, yeah.
Simon, what are you going to go to the barricades on?
That's a very good question. And I would love to think that there would be a sort of community epiphany, a tipping point. And it almost demands, this is going to sound counterintuitive, an apathy. Because in order to stop the erosion of the resources upon which we depend, we've got to stop doing what we're doing. We've got to stop this very normal animal instinct of acquisition. You know, we're just doing what we do. We're naked apes running around, getting territory and garnering as much as we possibly can for our family, tribe, community. And it's so hard. We like to think of ourselves as this terribly refined beast that's worked it all out. But in the end, and watch it, it's coming up any second now in the next couple of months, the little key flashpoint buttons that will get pressed with us will be, you'll save some money on tax, this is going to cost you less, and this will be wonderful for you and your family because you'll be able to buy a wraparound 4K TV at 72 inches. And we'll all go shinily down that avenue, looking at the bright light, going, oh, okay, briefly, because it triggers those very base instincts in humanity. Now, I'm sure all of us here are going, well, no, not me. But history tells a story which is all too apparent. And I have many times had discussions with extremely well-versed financiers about the logic of continual growth and how I remember a long time ago reading a little factoid which was in the assumption, and it's a reasonable one, that Jesus Christ existed. Had he invested £1 in our current economic system, he'd now have 100 million pounds. It doesn't work. So somewhere, I suppose, that Blocadian moment has to be everyone sitting up and going, actually, do you know, I've got enough. It's okay. Life's good. And actually, do you know what? Do I need to eat, and I'm not a vegetarian, I start with this. Do I need to eat meat 3 times a day? Do I need to eat 3 different species of animal a day? Or can I get by with maybe 1 a month? And is it a special moment? And is that 1 going to cost me 10 times more than than it would ordinarily? But of course now I can afford it because I've got my little veggie garden and it's all working rather nicely and the kids are digging it. It's going to sound like utopia, but you know what? We were doing it 70, 80 years ago. It worked. It was okay. So I suppose, sorry, there we are, I'll shut up.
Okay. Miranda, is it an issue of personal blockadia, change, behavioural? One of the aims of Bristol 2015 is to encourage behavioural change. That's one of its objectives.
I totally echo what Simon says. I think consumerism has gone mad. We want everything that's new and shiny, and we just need to realise that we don't need so much. We need to stop just taking and actually see what we can give back to the environment, be guardians of the planet a little bit more, rather than constantly taking natural resources. One day we'll turn around and realise that there's just nothing left. There's no habitat, there's no countryside, there are no resources left. It's something that worries me every day, and especially for my children when they're surrounded by the pressures of all of that as well.
Steph?
Well, I would just say well done for standing for Parliament. That just shows real bravery, actually, and courage. I mean, if you got in, it would be hell. But, because, in fact, we spend so much of our time criticising other people. Why don't we all just stand if we think we'd be so great at being MP? And, and actually that could if we had a sort of mass, it was a bit late for this generation, but if there was a mass standing of independents in every single constituency, who just good people who wanted to do what was right and knew a bit about something, in fact, we would change the political picture. So I think you're a star to stand. Don't you? I don't even know what party you're standing for, but I think you're brave.
We can guess.
I think
we could guess. And I mean, the other thing is we should all express our views to the businesses we're buying products of and to the people we're talking to over the counter. And if we have views on something, you should express it, because in fact they are always listening to our views. They're really sensitive to our views, but we tend to hold back. We probably all do. So there's a lot of stuff in that. If we want to see change, we have to be part of that, and it's a really big ask because it affects your own personal life. I remember Barbara Young, who at the time I think was Chief Exec of the Environment Agency, she probably shouldn't have said it, said that she would chain herself to the bulldozers if they were going ahead with one of the 7 barrage proposals, and she said that to Gordon Brown. And I had this vision of her doing, I thought, well, it's all right, though, she doesn't really kids. What if I died chaining myself to that bulldozer? Because I'd be with her in spirit, And this is the reality you hit. Every time you think, I'm going to stand up and do that, you then think of your personal situation and the impact that will have on you. We all need to work out how we can find a better course. John, would you be there with her, chained onto the bulldozer?
So John for Parliament or chained to the bulldozer?
Which would you think?
I'd go on with Barbara Young onto a bulldozer. Barbara's a friend of mine. I thought that was a really interesting question, a really interesting comment as well, and I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said because I agree with them. This is there's a nerd in me coming out, the scientist in me coming out. I get really angry when I hear utterly ill-informed discussions amongst the political classes about evidence-based policy. Because a lot of politicians believe that, but an awful lot more believe in the opposite, which is policy-based evidence. They know what they're going to do, and all they want is evidence to back it up, which is unbelievably dangerous. And if I had a chaining myself to a bulldozer, getting really, really angry and throwing my teddy bear out of the pram moment, it will be at the discussions that are coming up, which is really the last chance saloon on climate change. If we are not, as a nation, as a continent, and as a planet, prepared to take the steps that we have to take to stop catastrophic climate change, we are running out of time to do it, and I will chain myself to the railings of Parliament if they, and you can come and let me out. Because it is so blindingly obvious that we, of all the planetary limits that my colleagues have talked about, that we are rapidly running up against is climate change. It is truly scary. And if you're not worried about what's going to happen to climate change now, go home very frightened.
Oh, thank you, John.
Well done. And that's my moment, and that's my chaining myself to the reins of Parliament, and I'm going to get really angry because it is blindly obvious what we have to do. We know how to do it. The lights will not go out. Life will just be different, but it'll be better.
I'd like to ask the panel a question about nature inequality. Stephanie mentioned inequality, and the evidence shows that there is particular groupings in society who have least access to nature and need it most. It tends to be the young, the elderly, black minority, ethnic groups. And, there's almost a kind of sense there's a danger that nature is seen as quite elitist. It's something you visit, as opposed to the fact that nature is normal. It's everywhere around us. We've really got to make a big shift. So what's the panel's views about how do we really reach and engage and support those who actually need nature most?
One of the biggest, most damaging product of the way we currently live our lives is inequality generally, which is growing alarmingly. And is a massive, it's an economic threat, but it's also a huge social threat. And so inequality generally is just awful. And if you look at Pickett and Wilkinson's book, Piketty's books recently on economics, it is really scary about the consequences. As for nature inequality, I entirely agree with you. It is something that we can be dealt with through schools and the national curriculum, but it's also something that I think we need to work really hard on in terms of making it easier for people to have access to high quality green space close to their home, within walking distance, and so on. And we tend not to take that very seriously. I mean, I'm unbelievably lucky. I don't have to go more than 20 yards out to my back garden, and I have an old orchard down the side of my house, and the sparrowhawks come and kill blackbirds in it like Sam did, and I have foxes in the garden and so on. But for most people, that's just not possible. And recognising that and giving people access to that high-quality green space, partly through the national curriculum, partly through reducing inequality generally, which actually is a fundamental, serious political problem, would help to move in the right direction. And I thank you. I care passionately about that, and I think it's a really interesting comment.
Stephanie?
I mean, I think we could work a lot more closely. We are beginning to work more closely with the social charities on some of these issues. So there was a huge project that Wildlife Trust and others were involved with Mind, called Eco Minds, which was about treating depression, etc., with nature rather than drugs, which proved that it was 8 times cheaper. Incidentally, you got amazing results. But we have projects in Sheffield at the moment with older generations of people, and with that, it's often about isolation. And so if there's the capacity to support groups of older people coming together, they're also forming strong friendships, and in fact that's as much the value of it as being outside, but the being outside and in contact with nature is fundamental to it. So I think with the younger generation, the older generation can almost see ways forward. The NHS should be sort of arresting some of its drug-based therapies and beginning to shift whole chunks of expenditure into more nature-based therapies, both in terms of the obesity epidemic and the depression epidemic. And there was a PPS to the Health Secretary at our do on Monday we had with Tony Juniper for his book launch. And he was saying, but how do I do it? But, this is all long-term preventative stuff, and we're rubbish at that anyway, really, even within the current system. So, well, look, it's immediately 8 times cheaper to be shifting some of the treatment for depression. You don't even have to wait to be doing that. How we engage more effectively with the black and ethnic minority communities who don't traditionally engage as much with nature is really quite a big issue, actually. And we are horribly white and middle class in the Wildlife Trust, and I say that, but not all the beneficiary groups are at all, because a lot of the schools we work with is proper diversity in the schools. But in terms of the people in our trustee groups and the people on our staff, it's shocking. We're trying to take better action to address that. But I think certainly the Asian community is engaging much more with organisations like ours than they would have done 10 or 20 years ago, which is great. So we just got to take every step we can see as possible to be addressing these issues.
Miranda, do you see this when your children go out to nature and so on? Is it?
Yeah, I think with children, you need to make it relevant. You need to make it more attractive than watching TV or playing with an Xbox. I think we need to sort of up our sales pitch at the end of the day. I think you as a parent, you're always selling an idea to the children. So I never say to my kids, well, let's go for a walk. We're always going to go and play bug bingo, or we're going to go and make a den in the woods or something like that. So you've got to make it just more attractive, and the kids will they will embrace that. And I think I've done a number of interviews about taking kids out and how you sell nature to children, and how to get your kids out and about. And I was once asked, there was a comment about a parent saying that they were scared if they took their children out for a walk in the woods, that maybe the child would ask them a question about something that they didn't know the answer to, and that was actually restricting the parent. So, I mean, it happens every time I take my children out, where they'll go, Mum, what's that bird? And it's moved. And I'm like, oh, I think it might have been it. No. And it's like, well, okay, well, can we record the bird song? Can we try and take a photograph of it and make that into an activity? If as a parent you don't know what the answer is, I always turn that around and avoid embarrassment. And I can say, well, let's go home and look it up on the internet, so that you are engaging something that the children are interested in. You can go and use a computer, or better still, go back and use a book. But at the end of the day, I don't think parents need to be scared about this. And for me, it's definitely a sales pitch.
So, John, you had a quick point
there are several points in the discussion this evening where, some of you may be feeling guilty because your kids just don't have no interest in the environment, or your grandchildren have no interest in the environment. And to start even feeling guilty, I have personally utterly failed to get either of my children or any of my 5 grandchildren the slightest bit interested in the environment. I have completely failed. I'm still working on it, but sometimes it's hard. It's really hard. So please don't feel guilty if you haven't succeeded.
Simon, do you have
A perceived impediment, actually, a problem that I have witnessed on a number of occasions in my capacity actually working with the trusts for photo ops, particularly in urban areas, it has to be said, where schools are brought to try and protect. We get a photo opportunity to protect an area. And one notable one in a reserve in London, where the children were handed blue latex gloves before they went pond dipping.
Oh.
Now,
It ruined the photo, didn't
well, it did.
to be fair?
I clashed terribly with my shirt. No. The point is that there is, again, a generation of people who have a fear of the real world, a genuine fear, because they are fed through the media, it's our fault, these terrible stories of Weil's disease and various things that are going to kill you and foxes that are going to eat your babies and goodness knows what else that's out there that's about to destroy you. So it's much safer, actually, to be wrapped up in your box, looking through your Xbox at a virtual world, and you'll be much better off because it sells something. And what is being, it's just an industry. It's an industry that keeps people buying news, buying papers, buying tat, instead of getting out. And what we have to do is be brave enough as a society. It's down to individuals, but individuals need to hold hands as a society and say, we won't take that, I'm sorry. And if my kid happens to get a jippy tummy because he's stuck his fingers in his mouth after playing with tadpoles, it's okay. We all do it. If he falls out of a tree and snaps a leg, well, I'm not advocating broken limbs. I'm going away with sort of my Pressgang and all the rest of it. No, I'm not. But I am absolutely advocating scabby knees.
Okay.
Briefly, I just wanted to touch on how important the sort of social science and social marketing is and behaviour change and all these kind of ideas, because we touched on things like, making people scared and saying, look, this issue is amazingly, terrible, and why aren't people doing something about it? But that's because people have different motivators, and as a social species, most people care about what other people think about them. And actually, we aren't going to change unless we realise that. So I think looking into things like, love rather than loss and all those kind of things is very important. So that's an aside. But what I wanted to mention was we talk a lot about reconnecting children to nature. And actually, I think they might be our easiest audience because instinctively they explore the world around them, and that's what they do. But actually, I think our most important audience might actually be young adults in 20s and 30s, because we don't have kids, and we are, the millennials reported apparently the most stressed generation with increasing mental health issues. So actually, maybe we are the sort of short-term quick fix. Yes, long-term, we need to be introducing our children, but short term, we're the rising generation. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. And also, I co-chair a group called Bristol Nature Network, which is kind of doing that. So we're a group of young people in the city, just getting out into nature and also trying to help do stuff good for it. So, yeah.
Are we allowed to ask you to say what you do in more detail? Because you clearly know more than I'm going to know about how to engage. Yeah. In that network, in that network, not like every day at home. Or
yeah, that's something I run voluntarily. So what we do is all sorts of things. So it's partly a social group and partly helping conservation efforts in the city and things like that. So we do anything from pub quizzes about nature in the pubs down the road to helping connect volunteers to help actually do good things in our city. And also we originally set up to try and encourage the next generation of nature recorders. So quite a large and lots of different facets to what we do. But we've already got 500 members in the past year. We've only been going for just less than a year. So obviously there is there's some need out there, that, a niche that's not been filled.
And as soon as you're old enough to be your mother, then your ability to bring people together is much harder. So, I think the 20-somethings or 30-somethings who I know we work with are trying to instill some of that change you are, which is just fantastic to see. So it's how we empower that, I think, is really critical. You're right. Tends to be up to 24, our youth programmes tend to be 16 to 24, and then you're in a sort of a spot before you're a parent, I think, where there's not much focus. So it's an interesting point.
Simon?
I was just wanting to reflect again on how important it is not to necessarily make an interest in the natural world about the detail of the natural world. I'm enormously lucky, and I know just how lucky I am. And at home in Somerset, we have a patch of ground with a big enough lump of water in it for people to swim in, and we invite the entire class or school across to swim in the summer, or did last year. I didn't tell them what a water boatman looked like, or the fact that there was a duck nesting on the other side, or there was this. I just saw a bunch of kids having a fantastic time, and indeed young adults, their the siblings, coming in and getting in touch with the real world, and then having a barbecue on the edge of the pond, and then going away, having spent the entire day, and actually sitting down with cocoa or a glass of wine, if they were old enough, or anything else, in that environment, that came, as a consequence, coming away with a fully enriched experience that is unparalleled in anything we can make. And so well done you for encouraging precisely that. But I do think that, there's almost the potential for a program of getting outside. Don't call it nature. Call it what you like. I don't call it green disco. Call it anything. Do that. In fact, there's one company that I, forgive me, not a competitor, but somebody that we work occasionally alongside, who have introduced a football pitch in the middle of a woodland, which is a flipping good idea. Because instead of people traipsing through cement to get to the game, they traipse through trees and birds. And as they leave the football match, they do the same in a radial fashion, because all the cars are parked around the outside. Now that's brilliant. I think it's such a good idea. It's almost by tricking people into rubbing them alongside the natural world. And I've seen the same thing with,
You do that with meadows as well, don't you?
Excuse me?
You do that with meadows around the edge. You don't have to clear the ancient woodland for a football pitch.
No, the meadows are allowed as well.
Just to be clear, astroturfing the ancient woodland might not be a good plan.
Okay.
Yeah, just so I really welcome quite a bit about what we've heard about the future. And I just wonder whether we can get the story that we tell ourselves to be about how wonderful our futures could be, rather than about how wonderful our past was and how sorry we are about losing the past. And one of the things that I think in the nature conservation movement of which we're part, we tell ourselves a very strong story that past semi-natural is the best. But the trouble with past semi-natural is it's in the past. And I just wonder whether, are the habitats we need actually, not ancient hay meadows or even calm grassland or even native broadleaf woodland. It's some kind of completely new 21st century mixture of those. So how can we get this story of restoration and recovery to be about our wonderful future, not about our sadly missing past?
I'll start with John, then go through the panel.
I think that's really interesting, because quite a lot of tonight's discussion, I was beginning to get worried about it, is it's all going to hell in a handcart. And not all, there's a lot of problems. There really are a lot of problems. However, one of the ways we know we can influence policymakers and politicians is actually by giving them good news stories. Not complaining, not saying everything's bad and it's your fault, but actually by saying to them, look, we know there are problems, but we also know how to solve them. We know what we can do, and the future is not going to hell in a handcart, which I think is the point you're really making, and I entirely agree with you. If you look at, let's take some, so if you look at some of the, and we have some real conservation success stories in this country since the war. The reintroduction of the red kite is just amazing. The large blue butterfly, a whole lot of the creation of Lake and Heath Fen, the habitat creation, recreation, restoration. We know how to do this stuff, and we can do it successfully, and we know we can make a difference to the future. And actually, that message, I find, when I have to talk to a Secretary of State or a senior politician, is much more effective than grumbling at them. And it's not being dishonest. It's just telling the story in a more positive way. Human beings like something to be like positive news, and we don't necessarily like bad news. So that's one point. The other point is that the habitats that we cherish and care about are indeed the products of a long period of human occupation of the planet, and creation by people and interaction with people over millennia. Under under climate change by the end of the century, if I were to say to you, what's the climate and the habitats around Bristol going to be like by 2100, the answer is like Bordeaux. All your rivers will dry up in the summer. Did you realise that? Now, under those circumstances, we're going to have to make space for nature, but it's going to be a very different kind of nature. But again, that's not bad news. And our nature reserves will not be reserved to the species that are currently there. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the species that are colonising the British Isles now, naturally from the continent, where do they first? Little egrets were the first, but there are many others now: dragonflies, butterflies, other birds. Where do they first turn up? They turn up on our nature reserves. They don't turn up in the wider countryside. So nature reserves turn out to be really, really important, even though the future and the species they have on them will be very, very different. So we need to hang on to our reserves, and we need to expect them to change, and they will change, but it'll not be for the worse, it'll just be different.
Okay, just some quick views on the future. Stephanie?
We can make the future good if we get our acts together, and I think you're right, we have to talk about the future we do. And I think we can work really constructive to create amazing places. The Olympic Village experience was an interesting one for people, because I think everyone who saw it on the telly or went there just felt really inspired by the wildflowers. I think the problem we have is that we all, because there's such a low understanding of the ecology now, that we need to also communicate that the very, very few not completely knackered soils we have left in this country are so essential to the future. And soil is the big one, really. And that's why I sort of made the comments about the astroturf and the Etcher woodland, because one of the critical things about the public forest estate is the quality of its soils, because they haven't been completely knackered by arable farming for the last 70 years. So we have to tell a story, but also understand the science and be quite hard about those few bits we mustn't let go of.
Miranda?
I'm a very optimistic person. I think we just need to embrace change. We need to find solutions to the problems that are coming our way. I mean, if climate change is a reality, and it definitely is, we need, for example, to find crops that we can grow in a changing environment. We need to find ways of working with the new species that are colonising our environment. And we can mourn loss, but we need to embrace change at the end of the day. So I think we need to be flexible, we need to be adaptable. We can fight climate change, but at the end of the day, we need to work with whatever's thrown at us.
Simon?
Just perhaps to echo Miranda's sense of optimism, I'm very fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, to have had over the past 4 years the facility to run a little experiment on my home ground and to talk about what really can happen in such a short space of time. That ground, 10 acres, was, in my opinion, impoverished pasture. It would have been called improved pasture because the land was drained, had been fertilized for I don't know how many years and gone through various incarnations of agricultural stress. And in 4 years, having planted 2,500 trees, dug a pond and worked on grasslands and wildflower meadows, the biodiversity and the biomass has gone from this to this. So the resilience and the tenacity of the natural world, so long as there is that reservoir, and this is where the reserves come in, the reservoir of life is lurking in a hedge, in a reserve or any other. So long as we haven't annihilated species, they bounce back with astonishing rapidity. You know, when I moved to where I now live, there were no marbled white butterflies, there were no skippers, because of course the grassland had gone. And there were the voles you could count along the hedgerow. Now, vole-tastic, much to the chagrin of the trees, but there are voles everywhere which are supporting tawny owls, barn owls, foxes, weasels, and others. There are otters on the river, there are badgers there, and okay, some of them were there lurking in the corners. They've absolutely gravitated to this patch because it's the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. So to talk about, does it have to be this ancient space? No. Do we need to preserve those? Yes, of course we do, because they are the reservoirs. But is there hope for the future if we make a positive change in land restoration? 100%.
I'm delighted to see nature in schools as one of the proposals of the acts. And I had a fantastically enthusiastic biology teacher at school who got me interested in wildlife and animal behaviour. And then I became a science teacher myself. I'd like to know if the panel had enthusiastic teachers that got them interested.
All right,
Absolutely.
this is like one of those any questions final questions,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Final question, that's a
Did
good
you have an enthusiastic teacher, Stephanie? And what
Well,
why?
that's very. And you know, I never really thought about this in that context before. No, not at all. I had I think someone in the room will remember one of the most terrifying, sort of scary, controlling biology teachers. And so it wasn't why it got me into it. I went into it because I was inspired by being outside at home. But I did learn some things about human biology from her.
I think we'll move on to science.
Move on quickly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Good.
but not in that way.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just get that clear.
But I didn't know anything about ecology. It wasn't even covered.
Enthusiastic
So you were very lucky.
Education, Sir John?
Well, I got my first bird book, the Observer's Book of British Birds, when I was 7. So I was already hooked at that stage, and I've wasted more time in my life watching birds from the age of 7 than I probably should have done. But it's been great.
John, wasted.
But it's been great. And yes, I did actually at grammar school in Leyland in Lancashire, where I was brought up. I had a wonderful, young, enthusiastic biology teacher called Brian Barnes, who inspired me and told me that I could be a professional biologist. I had no idea what a professional biologist did. It was only because of Brian that I actually went down that route. And I remember the bright boys in those days did chemistry, physics, and maths, and the girls did biology. And I told my first real conscious lie as an adult to my headmaster by saying that I wanted to be a vet. It was a complete lie. I wanted to be a biologist. But it allowed me, so they had to rejig the entire sixth form timetable so I could do biology. And it's been great.
Good.
So your lie was going to be you were going to be a girl. You pretended to be a girl. Well, I too had a very inspirational biology teacher, and I totally owe my career to her because I had no idea what I wanted to do at sixth form when all my friends wanted to be lawyers and doctors and this, that and the other, and I just loved biology, and she taught in such an inspirational way, and I can see it in my children now as well. My little boy is lucky enough to have a similarly inspirational teacher at school who, when I was nudging her the other day that we ought to go out for another sort of nature walk, she said, well, we need to do some literacy that day. And I said, well, why don't we just do literacy outside? So she turned a literacy lesson into a nature walk, or a nature walk into a literacy lesson. And you need people like that who are really, really resourceful, who have ways of inspiring children and hopefully doing it outside the classroom.
Who inspired you, Simon?
Well, I have to confess, I dropped biology at the soonest possible opportunity.
We're not doing very well on this side.
But forgive me, let me explain briefly why, because I was horribly precocious, and I had already read quite a lot of stuff by the time we'd started biology in senior school. And not only did it, I was lucky, because having read it, I was doing, getting good grades and all the rest of it. But I was desperately frustrated, and am to this day, if I'm honest, by the topsy-turvy way in which biology is introduced to young people. To me, to make the subject, the word itself can put someone off. Zoology, the natural world, wildlife, battlefields, call it what you will. To engage young people in that world absolutely is to get them out and to see it for real, but to talk about lions and wildebeest, and to talk about ecosystems and the pyramid of life, not to talk about cilia and single-celled creatures, stamens, and all that stuff, which of course I'm interested in now, but I'm only interested in the minutiae because I've already been captivated by the big picture and the story. So I would love to see biology starting in a very, which of course it does to a certain extent now, but when you get into formal education, it's still we're right back down there with the protozoa. And I'm sorry, if protozoa were that sexy, there'd be a lot of natural history films about them. And there aren't.
What do you mean about that?
So I think there's time for a revolution in our education system to shake it up and say, they will come. They will come to the protozoa and to the stamen so long as you engage them in the big dramatic stories in the first place.
Okay, just one, I'm sorry we haven't got any time for more questions, but just one quick question to Stephanie. The Nature and Wellbeing Act, then, this is something we're campaigning for in the next Parliament, but what can we do between now and then?
Well, we can all, if people come canvassing on your doorstep, you ask them, are they going to back Nature and Wellbeing Act? Please email your MP, your potential current MPs and potential MPs, so your parliamentary candidates. If you can, just ask us, and the more people who ask, the more reaction we get. And that's what we can do up until the election. And of course, after the election, could be quite an interesting picture. Then it's about engaging, actually actively engaging with your MP. Because if you think what it's like being an MP, and I don't know if the guy's still here, but the mailbag, even if it's emails, is still quite big. And if you don't get sane letters saying, you know, every now and then something really passionate and from the heart, then you're not hearing the views of your constituents. So that's what we should be doing.
So I'd like to thank Simon, Stephanie, Sir John, Miranda. Thank you so much for coming, and please continue the debate. Thank you very much.